What if I told you that some of the most terrifying places in history were not battlefields, but buildings? Not fortresses, not bunkers, but ordinary walls, doors, and chimneys designed with chilling precision. Could architecture itself become a weapon? Every brick, every ventilation shaft, every hidden passage, nothing was improvised. It was all drawn on paper, calculated with numbers, signed with names, and approved like any other construction project. Yet its purpose was unlike anything the world had ever seen, to make death efficient, silent, and invisible. But behind the blueprints and budgets were people engineers, officers, and prisoners, each trapped in a system that turned routine into horror. Some believed they were just doing their job. Others risked their lives to resist. And many, far too many, never had the chance to leave. In this story, we'll journey into that hidden machinery, how it was built, how it functioned, and how survivors and investigators later pieced together the truth. You will see how ordinary tools of design and administration became instruments of destruction. So, how was such a system possible? And what lessons can we learn today, when the line between routine and atrocity is thinner than we think? 1. The machine built by men. At first glance, history often tempts us to imagine chaos armies storming through towns, hatred erupting in violence, and killings carried out in the heat of the moment. But what unfolded in the heart of the Reich between 1941 and 1945 was something entirely different. It was not chaos, it was a system. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, it was a system designed, built, and maintained by ordinary men. Think of an architect sketching lines on paper, an engineer calculating the angle of a chimney, a clerk signing off on delivery forms. None of these actions looked like murder on their own, and yet, when combined, they created a machine of death so precise that trains, chambers, and furnaces ran in rhythm like gears of a factory. It is chilling to realize that genocide did not require only hatred, it required blueprints, contracts, and schedules. One survivor once said, "We did not die by accident, we died by appointment." That line reminds us that bureaucracy itself can be turned into a weapon when humanity is stripped away. And so, before we examine the walls, ovens, and chambers themselves, we must understand how this mindset took root. How did ideology on paper become work orders in practice? Every great crime begins as an idea. And in Nazi Germany, that idea was wrapped in speeches, slogans, and promises of a new order. But ideology alone cannot build walls or light furnaces. To turn hatred into action, it had to pass through the hands of clerks, architects, and engineers. Words became blueprints, policy became paperwork. Inside the SS construction office, requests arrived with the same dry language you might find in any government department. Terms like special treatment or disinfection appeared on documents that never once mentioned killing. Yet everyone along the chain understood, or at least chose not to question, what these phrases truly meant. A ventilation shaft drawn on a plan wasn't just ventilation. It was the channel through which poison would be released. We can see how the Nazi system blurred responsibility. A manager in Berlin approved a budget. A builder laid bricks in Poland. Neither might feel they had killed anyone. But together, they sustained the system. It's a sobering reminder. Bureaucracy, when stripped of conscience, can become just as lethal as a weapon. And here lies the bridge to our next part of the story, because those blurred responsibilities soon found their most chilling expression in the work of one civilian company, Topf Söhne, the makers of the ovens. 3. Civilian engineers and the ovens. When we think of the Holocaust, the image that comes to mind is often of soldiers in uniform. Yet some of the most decisive contributions did not come from men with rifles, but from men with drafting tools and factory stamps. The German firm Topf Söhne was one such example. For decades, they had built cremation furnaces for cities across Germany, civil equipment, hospitals, municipalities, cemeteries, ordinary needs of ordinary life. But when the SS called, they agreed to design something entirely new, furnaces that could burn continuously, consuming hundreds of bodies a day. Engineers calculated airflow. They designed multi-retort ovens where 3 corpses could be incinerated at once. They even adjusted fuel use so that human fat could feed the flames, reducing coal consumption. It was, in their words, an efficiency improvement. What lesson do we draw here? That evil doesn't always announce itself with weapons or flags. Sometimes it hides in the language of technical progress. An engineer who says, "I'm just solving a problem," may not stop to ask, what problem and at what cost? And so, with furnaces perfected and blueprints approved, the machine was ready for its next stage. Let's now step inside the buildings themselves and see how architecture of deception guided victims through a deadly routine. The flow of crematoria 2 and 3. 4. Architecture of deception. The flow of crematoria 2 and 3. Imagine arriving after days inside a crowded train. You are exhausted, confused, clinging to a bag that holds your last piece of home. Then you are led down a ramp into a basement. Signs on the wall tell you to remember where you left your shoes, because you will collect them later. Hooks line the walls. Benches are placed carefully in the corners. Even shower heads hang from the ceiling. Everything feels strangely organized, almost reassuring. But this design was no accident. Every doorway, every hallway, every sign was part of an illusion. Victims undressed in one cellar, then moved through a narrow passage into another room, the gas chamber where airtight doors and hidden vents awaited. From the outside, guards dropped Zyklon B pellets through openings in the roof. Within minutes, silence fell. Above, the furnace hall stood ready. A freight elevator carried bodies from chamber to oven. 5 triple muffle furnaces worked in sequence, feeding smoke into a single chimney that rose like a monument over the camp. Nothing was improvised. Everything was planned. The lesson here is unsettling. Design can guide not only movement but belief. Architecture can comfort and deceive. And yet, before these massive buildings came into operation, there was a first makeshift step. To understand the evolution of the system, we must return to the countryside, to the simple farmhouses turned into death traps, bunkers 1 and 2. 5. Before the factory, bunkers 1 and 2. Long before the towering chimneys of Birkenau became infamous, the killing began in silence inside 2 ordinary rural houses. They stood at the edge of the forest, with sloping roofs and thick walls, the kind of buildings you might pass without a second glance. But in 1942, they were transformed into the first gas chambers of Auschwitz. Windows were sealed, doors reinforced, openings cut in the roof for pellets of Zyklon B. Inside, the rooms were divided so that hundreds could be packed together at once. There were no chimneys, no furnaces, no elaborate machinery, only deception and brutality. Victims were told it was a disinfection procedure. Then the doors were locked, the gas released, and the silence began. Afterward, bodies were buried in mass graves dug nearby. Later, when graves overflowed, crude grills made from railway tracks were built, turning open pits into makeshift cremation sites. Smoke rose through the trees, carrying the smell of burning flesh into the countryside. Here we see the progression, from improvised to industrial, from rural houses to purpose-built crematoria. Mass murder was not born fully formed, it was tested, adapted, and scaled. And with each step forward, the machine required something else: logistics, timetables, and quotas. Which leads us to the backbone of the entire system: the railways. 6. Railways, timetables, and quotas. If the crematoria were the engine of the system, then the railways were its arteries. Without trains, the machine could not function. From across Europe, timetables were drawn up with the same precision as for passenger lines. Cattle cars were scheduled, sidings cleared, arrival slots assigned. A transport leaving Hungary might be logged days in advance, with SS officers calculating exactly how many men, women, and children would arrive and when. At the ramp in Birkenau, efficiency continued. Families were forced to line up quickly. Selections lasted only minutes. The strong were sent to labor. The weak, the elderly, and children were directed toward the chambers. All of it was synchronized with the capacity of the ovens above. If too many trains arrived at once, the pressure spilled into pits and open-air burnings. What strikes us today is how ordinary it all looked on paper. Numbers, columns, schedules. A transport was processed, much like cargo, with quotas to be met and reports to be filed. Yet behind each line on a form was a family torn apart, a community erased. And here lies the paradox. The same bureaucracy that moves goods and passengers in peacetime became, in wartime, a conveyor belt of death. Next, we'll see how language itself became part of the machinery, how harmless words on forms concealed the most brutal reality, the paper shields of euphemism. 7. Paper shields. Euphemisms, forms, and the bureaucratic mind. One of the most unsettling features of this system was not only what was built, but how it was described. The language of extermination rarely spoke of killing. Instead, it spoke of resettlement, disinfection, or special treatment. Gas chambers were marked on blueprints as corpse cellars. Deportations were logged as evacuations. This was more than simple code. It was a shield, a way for thousands of clerks, engineers, and officers to sign papers without confronting the human reality behind them. A ventilation shaft could be approved as a technical necessity, never acknowledged as the path for poison. A delivery of Zyklon B could be stamped as pest control, ignoring its deadly purpose. Here lies a painful truth. Language can numb conscience. When murder is disguised as procedure, ordinary people may convince themselves they are not responsible. And that is why euphemisms are so dangerous. They transform horror into routine. For us today, the lesson is clear. Words matter. The way we label actions can either reveal truth or bury it. And while the language softened reality on paper, inside the camps there were men who could never escape that reality. They were forced to touch it, breathe it, and carry it every single day. They were called the Sonderkommando. 8. Inside the engine room, the Sonderkommando. Among the prisoners at Auschwitz, a few were chosen for a task that no one could ever have imagined. They were the Sonderkommando men forced to work at the very heart of the killing process. Each day they waited as trains arrived. They watched families step off, still clutching their belongings, unaware of what awaited. And when the gas chamber doors finally fell silent, it was the Sonderkommando who opened them. They were the ones who pulled bodies apart, who carried them to the ovens, who sifted through ashes for gold teeth and rings. They lived close to the furnaces, separate from other prisoners, constantly monitored by the SS. They knew their role was temporary, that every few months they too would be killed and replaced, so no witnesses remained. And yet, in the darkest of places, humanity flickered. Some whispered words of comfort to victims in their final moments. Some risked everything to leave behind notes, diaries, and photographs hidden in the soil, so that one day the truth would not be lost. In 1944, a group even staged a desperate uprising, blowing up part of Crematorium 4. Their lesson to us is heavy but vital. Even in a world designed to erase every trace of life, fragments of resistance and memory survived. But the system never paused. When trains came faster than ovens could burn, the Nazis turned to cruel improvisations, open pits and fire. That is where our story turns next. Overload and improvisation. 9. Overload and improvisation. Pits, grates, and process improvements. By the summer of 1944, the system was stretched to its breaking point. Trains from Hungary arrived one after another, thousands of men, women, and children every day. Even the giant furnaces of Birkenau could not keep pace. The solution was as crude as it was horrifying: open-air pits. Long trenches were dug near the crematoria. Railroad tracks were laid across them to form makeshift grills. Bodies were stacked like cordwood, doused with fuel, and set alight. Witnesses recall the flames rising day and night, and the smoke hanging like a permanent cloud over the forest. Engineers spoke of process improvements. They noted how body fat, when melted by heat, could serve as additional fuel. They adjusted methods, stirring the piles to keep the fire burning evenly. It was treated like an experiment, an efficiency problem to be solved. For the prisoners forced to tend these fires, the experience was beyond words. Some later described the ground itself trembling as gases escaped from burning corpses. Others remembered storms that flooded pits, causing bodies to float to the surface. Here, we see the ultimate perversion of technical thinking, the pursuit of efficiency applied not to production, but to destruction. And while the fires raged outside, another reality grew inside the camp itself, an atmosphere where even the sky and the air seemed to testify. That is the subject of our next chapter: smoke, smell, and silence. 10. Smoke, smell, and silence. The sensory history. Survivors often say that the first thing newcomers noticed at Auschwitz was not the guards, nor the barbed wire, but the air. It was heavy, dense, carrying a smell that clung to skin, hair, and memory. A mixture of burning flesh, coal, smoke, and ash. It lingered everywhere. Day and night, the chimneys poured out their message. Villagers nearby saw the grey plumes rise. Prisoners in the camp watched flakes of ash drift down like snow. Even meals could not escape it. Members of the Sonderkommando recalled that when they ate, the smoke was still in their mouths. Perhaps most chilling of all was how quickly this became routine. The silence of officers, the absence of explanation, made it feel almost normal. The gardens were neat, the offices tidy, the schedules precise, all while the sky above remained clouded with the evidence of destruction. The lesson here is simple but profound. When horror repeats long enough, it risks becoming background noise. That is why testimony matters, because silence and smoke cannot speak on their own. And yet, the Nazis knew the smoke would betray them. As the war turned, they sought to erase what they had built. Which brings us to the next part of the story. Erasing the crime versus rebuilding the record. By late 1944, the smoke that once proclaimed Nazi power had become a liability. The Red Army was advancing, and the SS knew the world would soon see what had been done. Their response was swift. Destroy the evidence. Crematoria were blown up. Gas chambers were sealed and dismantled. Technical drawings and correspondence were burned. Even the Sonderkommando, the living witnesses, were executed in waves to ensure silence. In some camps, trees were planted over mass graves, or farms built on the very soil where thousands had perished. And yet, history has a way of leaving traces. At Auschwitz, ruins of chimneys, collapsed roofs, and scattered bricks remained. In Treblinka and Sobibor, aerial photographs taken during the war revealed outlines of vanished buildings. Diaries buried in the ground by prisoners were later unearthed. Companies like Topf Söhne left behind fragments of contracts and invoices. Each piece of paper, each surviving stone, whispered the truth the Nazis tried to bury. The lesson is clear. Truth, though fragile, can outlast even the most determined attempts to erase it. It survives in fragments, in memories, in records pieced together long after the flames die. 12. Why it matters: ethics, accountability, and early warning signs. The story of Auschwitz is not only about the past, it is also a warning about the present and the future. Because what happened was not the work of monsters from another world. It was the work of men, engineers, architects, clerks, and officers who believed they were simply doing their jobs. That is why this history speaks to us today. It reminds us that evil often hides in routine, in the quiet signature at the bottom of a form, in the small decision not to ask what our work is really serving, in the silence when words could have exposed the truth. The lesson is not only about remembering the victims, though we must always do that. It is also about learning to recognize the warning signs, euphemisms that soften cruelty, bureaucracies that value efficiency over humanity, and systems that reduce people to numbers. For American audiences, the takeaway is personal. Whether we are teachers, engineers, students, or parents, we all hold a piece of responsibility for the systems we create and sustain. We can choose to ask questions. We can choose to speak out. Because history shows us that silence builds chimneys just as surely as bricks do.